The mist hangs heavy over the water, a grey shroud that muffles sound and steals colour from the world. Dawn is breaking, but here on the coast of Lindisfarne in 793 CE, light struggles to penetrate the gloom. The monks of the monastery move quietly through their morning prayers, the sacred words of their psalms carried away by the salt breeze. Then comes the sound, a rhythmic beating, like the pulse of some vast, approaching beast. The monks pause, confusion crossing their faces. The beating grows louder. Thump, thump, thump. And then they see them, dragon-headed prows emerging from the fog like monsters from nightmare. Dozens of longships cutting through the waves, each filled with men whose very appearance speaks of violence. Some wear bear pelts draped over their shoulders, others wolfskins complete with snarling heads. Their eyes burn with an unnatural intensity, their bodies painted and scarred in patterns that speak of blood oaths and dark rituals. Before the monks can flee, the warriors leap from their ships into the shallows. Some charge forward on all fours like beasts, foaming at the mouth, biting their shields in frenzy. Others move with an eerie, focused calm, their wolfish grins more terrifying than the howls of their companions. They feel no fear, no pain. Weapons that would stop ordinary men barely slow their advance. These are not merely raiders seeking gold. These are the elite warriors of the north, berserkers and Ulfhednar, men who have transformed themselves into something beyond human, something that weaponizes terror itself. The massacre that followed would echo through centuries, marking the beginning of the Viking Age in Western consciousness. But what created these warriors who seemed impervious to fear and pain? What separates the historical reality from the myth? And what does their existence tell us about the outer limits of human capacity for violence? In the blood-soaked centuries of the Viking Age, from that first raid on Lindisfarne in 793 to the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, no warriors inspired more dread than these elite fighters who blurred the line between man and beast. Their legacy has echoed through time, shaping our understanding of the Vikings and our fascination with warriors who transcend normal human limitations. This is the story of the most terrifying Viking warriors in history, men whose existence is confirmed by archaeology, historical records, and the terrified accounts of those who faced them in battle. Men who were all too real. To understand the berserkers, we must first understand the world that forged them, a harsh northern landscape where survival demanded extraordinary measures, and where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was thin as morning mist. The term berserker itself tells us much about these warriors. In Old Norse, berserker likely meant bear shirt or bear shirt, with scholars debating whether it referred to warriors who wore bear pelts or those who went into battle without armour, protected only by a battle-frenzy state. Archaeological evidence from the Torslanda helmet plates from Sweden, dating to the 7th century, shows figures in bear pelts performing ritual dances, suggesting the bearskin interpretation has deep roots. The earliest written account comes from the Ynglinga saga, where Snorri Sturluson describes the followers of Odin. His men went without mail coats and were frenzied as dogs or wolves. They bit their shields and were as strong as bears or bulls. They slew men, but neither fire nor iron could hurt them. This is called berserker gang. This berserker gang, or berserker gang, was the defining characteristic that separated these warriors from ordinary fighters. It was a state of ecstatic fury in which the warrior became something other than human. The 13th century Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson describes it as a transformation. They howled like wild beasts, foamed at the mouth and gnawed the rim of their shields. When the fit came upon them, they were not like human beings. The Haraldskvæði, a skaldic poem from the late 9th century, provides one of our earliest descriptions of berserkers in action, calling them wolf-skinned warriors who carry bloody shields and redden their spear points in battle. These men formed the elite guard of Harald Fairhair, the first king to unite Norway, suggesting their high status in Viking society. But how did one become a berserker? The path appears to have been multifaceted, combining physical training, psychological conditioning, spiritual initiation, and possibly pharmacological elements. Young warriors likely began their journey through intensive physical training, pushing their bodies beyond normal human limits. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age skeletal remains shows asymmetrical bone development consistent with weapon training from early adolescence. The sagas speak of young men testing themselves through extreme endurance trials, swimming in freezing waters, sitting naked in snowdrifts, and engaging in combat sports that bordered on lethal. The psychological aspects of berserker training may have been even more demanding. The sagas describe rituals of isolation, sleep deprivation, exposure to extreme temperatures, and meditation on animistic spirits. These practices bear striking similarities to shamanic initiations found across northern Eurasian cultures, suggesting a shared cultural origin. The spiritual dimension cannot be overlooked. In the pre-Christian Norse worldview, the line between human and animal was permeable. The god Odin himself was said to be able to send his consciousness into animal form, while his body lay as if dead, a practice called hamfaria, or shape journey. Berserkers were considered to be directly connected to Odin, the god of ecstasy, inspiration, and battle frenzy. The Volsunga saga describes how Sigmund and his son Sinfjotli lived in the forest as wolves, suggesting an initiatory period of becoming the animal that may have been part of berserker training. This spiritual transformation was likely reinforced through rituals, including wearing the skins of powerful animals and mimicking their movements and vocalizations until the boundary between human and beast consciousness blurred. But what about the berserker rage itself? How did these warriors achieve a state where they felt no pain, demonstrated superhuman strength, and fought with a fury that terrified even hardened warriors? Several theories have been proposed. The most controversial involves the use of psychoactive substances. The fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, recognizable by its red cap with white spots, contains compounds that can induce states of altered consciousness, including feelings of strength, sensory distortion, and dissociation from pain. These mushrooms grow throughout Scandinavia and have been used in shamanic practices by other northern cultures. Ethnobotanist Kevin Feeney has argued that the symptoms described in berserkers, sweating, trembling, facial swelling, and rapid mood shifts from melancholy to aggression, are consistent with Amanita muscaria intoxication. The mushroom's effects typically peak about 3 hours after consumption and last for several more, matching accounts that berserkers would turn normal after the battle fury left them exhausted and vulnerable. Other candidates for berserker intoxicants include henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, and bog myrtle, Myrica gale, both of which were known in Viking Age Scandinavia and have psychoactive properties. Alcohol, particularly strong mead or beer, may have played a role, though the level of coordination described in berserker fighting suggests something more complex than simple drunkenness. However, pharmacological explanations alone seem insufficient. The berserker state may have also been achieved through self-induced, altered states of consciousness. Modern research on extreme sports athletes, marathon runners, and practitioners of certain martial arts has documented states of consciousness characterized by pain suppression, enhanced strength, and altered perception of time, all without drugs. These states involve the brain's production of endorphins, adrenaline, and other neurochemicals that can transform human capabilities. Through ritualized breathing techniques, rhythmic movement, and intense mental focus, warriors may have learned to trigger these states at will. Some scholars have proposed medical explanations as well. Conditions such as temporal lobe epilepsy can produce religious ecstasy, hypergraphia, compulsive writing, and altered states of consciousness. Others have suggested that some berserkers may have had congenital conditions like Soto's syndrome, characterized by excessive growth and strength, or genetic factors affecting testosterone production. The truth likely involves a combination of these factors: cultural practices, psychological conditioning, possibly pharmacological aids, and perhaps individuals with natural predispositions to altered states. What's clear is that the berserker phenomenon was real enough to be institutionalised in Viking society. By the height of the Viking Age, berserkers had become a recognised social class. The Gragas, Iceland's medieval legal code, specifically mentions berserkers and prescribes outlawry as punishment for going berserk. They served as shock troops, elite guards for chieftains and kings, and sometimes as hired mercenaries. Their social status appears to have been ambivalent, respected and feared for their battle prowess, but also regarded with suspicion for their unpredictability. The berserker in battle was a terrifying sight. According to the sagas, the transformation began with uncontrollable shivering and facial swelling. Their faces would discolour, turning red or dark blue. They would gnaw the edges of their shields, howl like wild animals, and demonstrate supernatural strength, sometimes uprooting trees or tearing apart stone hearths with their bare hands. In combat, they were said to be impervious to fire and iron, meaning they either felt no pain from burns and wounds or could suppress their reaction to them. They fought with a wild, uncontrolled fury that broke enemy formations through sheer terror. The psychological impact of facing such opponents cannot be overstated. Even hardened warriors would break and run rather than face these human beasts, who seemed impervious to normal human limitations. But the berserker state came with costs. After the battle fury subsided, berserkers were described as weak and vulnerable, as if the superhuman effort had drained their life force. Some sagas suggest they could not control when the berserker state came upon them, making them dangerous to friend and foe alike. The Ynglinga saga notes that, while the fit lasted, he could perform great feats, but afterward he became weaker than before and was as feeble as if he had just recovered from sickness. Archaeological evidence supports aspects of the literary accounts. The Torslunda helmet plates show figures in bear costumes performing ritual dances. Runestones depict warriors in animal skins. Graves have been found containing warrior equipment alongside bear and wolf remains, suggesting ritual connections. A warrior burial at Berka in Sweden contained a man interred with bear claws, arranged as if he had been buried wearing a bear skin. Perhaps most telling is the reaction of those who encountered berserkers in battle. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, recording Viking raids, speaks of warriors who fought as if possessed. Irish annals describe Norse invaders who were like men who had lost their wits. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an Arab diplomat who encountered Vikings on the Volga River in 922 CE, described warriors who howl like dogs before battle and fight with reckless abandon. Consider this: would you stand your ground against a warrior who felt no pain, fought with inhuman strength, and believed himself transformed into a wild beast? A warrior who might be bleeding from multiple wounds yet continued fighting with undiminished fury? The psychological advantage alone made berserkers worth their weight in gold to Viking war leaders. But the berserkers were not the only elite warriors who struck terror into the hearts of Viking enemies. There existed another class of fighter whose methods were different, but equally terrifying: the wolf warriors known as Ulfhednar. If berserkers were the storm, Ulfhednar were the shadow. Where berserkers raged with uncontrolled fury, the wolf warriors hunted with calculated precision. Both served Odin, but they embodied different aspects of the All-Father. The berserkers his ecstatic battle madness, the Ulfhednar his cunning and predatory nature. The name Ulfhednar, singular, Ulfhedin, translates directly as wolf coat or wolf skin, referring to the wolf pelts these warriors wore. Like the berserkers, they underwent a form of transformation, but accounts suggest their altered state manifested differently. Where berserkers were chaotic and overwhelming, Ulfhednar were described as cold, calculating, and silent, like wolves stalking prey. The Haraldskvæði, composed around 900 CE, distinguishes between these warrior types. The berserkers roared where the battle raged, the wolfcoats howled and shook their spears. This distinction suggests different fighting styles and possibly different methods of achieving their battle states. Archaeological evidence for Ulfhednar parallels that of berserkers. The Tiengvida image stone from Gotland dating to the 8th century shows a figure wearing what appears to be a wolf skin, complete with head. The previously mentioned Torslunda helmet plates include not only bear warriors, but also figures in wolf skins. Graves throughout Scandinavia have been found containing wolf bones arranged around human remains, suggesting ritual significance. The wolf held a special place in Norse cosmology. Odin himself was accompanied by 2 wolves, Geri and Freki, whose names mean the ravenous and the greedy one. The monstrous wolf Fenrir was destined to kill Odin during Ragnarok. Wolves represented both destruction and protection in Norse mythology, dangerous but also symbols of elite warrior bands. The training of Ulfhednar likely differed from that of berserkers. Where berserkers embraced chaos and fury, wolf warriors appear to have cultivated stealth, endurance, and pack tactics. The sagas describe them moving silently through forests, ambushing enemies, and fighting with coordinated precision rather than individual frenzy. Initiation into the Ulfhednar might have involved ritual isolation in the wilderness, learning to move, hunt, and think like wolves. Some scholars have suggested that young warriors would live apart from society for periods, hunting and surviving in wolf territory, perhaps even running with wolf packs, a practice documented in some traditional cultures where humans have formed unusual bonds with wild wolves. The spiritual dimension of becoming Ulfhedin centred on Odin's aspect as a god of the hunt and of death. In the Volsunga saga, Sigmund and Sinfjotli don wolfskins and cannot remove them for 10 days, during which time they communicate only by howling. This suggests a ritual period of becoming the wolf that transformed the initiate's identity and capabilities. Unlike berserkers, who often fought in a state of uncontrolled frenzy, Ulfhednar were described as maintaining control while accessing superhuman abilities. They moved with unnatural speed and coordination, struck with precision, and demonstrated exceptional night vision and sensory awareness, all attributes of wolves. Their fighting style emphasised stealth, ambush, and psychological warfare. They would infiltrate enemy territory under cover of darkness, strike at vulnerable points, and vanish before a counterattack could be organised. Some accounts describe them howling in different patterns to communicate during battle, creating the impression that they were everywhere at once. The terror they inspired was different from, but equal to that of berserkers. If berserkers represented the fear of being overwhelmed by unstoppable force, Ulfhednar embodied the dread of being hunted, of knowing predators were watching from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This psychological impact made them particularly effective for night raids, forest warfare, and operations behind enemy lines. Like berserkers, Ulfhednar served as elite guards for kings and chieftains. Harald Fairhair's elite guard included both warrior types, according to the Haraldskvedi. They also conducted special operations that required stealth rather than direct confrontation, such as reconnaissance, assassination, and sabotage. The question of how Ulfhednar achieved their altered states remains open. The pharmacological theories applied to berserkers may be relevant here as well, though perhaps with different substances or preparations. Wolf warriors might have used lower doses of psychoactives to maintain greater control while still accessing heightened senses and reduced pain sensitivity. Alternatively, their state might have been achieved primarily through psychological techniques, meditation, sensory deprivation, and visualization practices that allowed them to become the wolf mentally without completely surrendering a human consciousness. Modern studies of elite military units have documented similar states of controlled dissociation that allow for enhanced performance while maintaining tactical awareness. The wolf warrior's relationship with their animal aspect appears to have been more symbiotic than transformative. Rather than being possessed by the wolf spirit, they formed a partnership with it, drawing on its strengths while retaining human intelligence. This difference may explain why Ulfhednar were considered more reliable than berserkers, who could be dangerous to allies when their battle fury took hold. Archaeological findings at Apokra in Sweden have uncovered ritual sites where animal sacrifices, particularly of wolves, were conducted in connection with warrior cults. These sites contained weapons deliberately broken or bent, a practice associated with ritual killing of objects to send them to the spirit world. This suggests complex ceremonies connecting warriors to animal spirits through sacrifice and ritual. Ibn Fadlan, in his account of the Rus, Swedish Vikings settled in what is now Russia, described warriors who wore animal skins and moved like beasts of prey. He noted their ability to travel great distances with minimal provisions and their exceptional skill at moving through forests undetected, attributes consistent with the Ulfhednar described in Norse sources. The psychological impact of Ulfhednar tactics is captured in a passage from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describing a Viking raid in 1011. They went everywhere in bands, robbing and killing. One did not know who was pursuing whom, and they became the hunters and we the prey. This inversion of normal warfare, where armies meet in formation, into a predator-prey relationship, was the hallmark of Ulfhednar operations. Consider the terror of being a Saxon villager or Frankish soldier, hearing wolf howls in the night that were not quite natural, catching glimpses of human figures moving with animal grace through the trees, knowing that death might come at any moment from any direction. The psychological warfare aspect of Ulfhednar tactics was as important as their physical effectiveness. Would you rather face a berserker's overwhelming fury or an Ulfhedin's calculated hunt? Both represented the outer limits of human capability, transformed through training, ritual, and possibly pharmacology into something that transcended normal limitations. Both served as living weapons in the Viking arsenal, specialised for different tactical situations, but equally terrifying to those who faced them. But beyond these warrior classes, the Viking Age produced individual champions whose prowess in battle became legendary, men whose names were spoken with awe and fear throughout the medieval world. Let us turn now to three such warriors, whose exploits are documented in historical records, and whose abilities seem to blur the line between the human and the superhuman. Legendary Viking champions. While berserkers and Ulfhednar represented institutionalised warrior traditions, certain individual Vikings achieved such fearsome reputations that their mere presence could change the course of battles. Their stories, recorded in sagas and chronicles, provide windows into the elite warrior culture of the Viking Age, and the almost superhuman capabilities that some fighters developed. Few Viking warriors embody the complexity of Norse culture better than Egil Skallagrimsson, whose life is chronicled in Egil's saga, considered one of the most historically reliable of the Icelandic sagas. Born around 904 CE in Iceland to a family with berserker lineage, Egil was marked as extraordinary from birth, described as dark-haired, ugly, and preternaturally strong. At age 7, Egil killed another boy with an axe during a ball game dispute. Rather than showing remorse, he returned home to be praised by his mother, who declared he had the makings of a true Viking. This early incident set the pattern for a life where violence and poetry would be inextricably linked. Egil's father, Skallagrim, was himself described as subject to shape-shifting and berserker rages. During one such episode, he killed his son's favourite playmate during a ball game, prompting the 7-year-old Egil to drive an axe into his father's shoulder in retaliation. Rather than punishing this act, Skallagrim acknowledged his son's courage, recognising the berserker spirit that they shared. What made Egil truly exceptional was not just his fighting prowess, but the combination of berserker fury with poetic genius and cunning intelligence. He composed his first poem at age 3, and would go on to become one of the greatest skalds, poets, of the Viking Age. This combination of warrior and poet was highly valued in Norse culture, where the ability to immortalise deeds in verse was as important as performing them. Egil's berserker nature manifested throughout his life. The saga describes how a great deal of shape-shifting took place in him. Before battle, with his face swelling and changing colour. One particularly vivid account describes how his eyebrows sagged down over his cheeks and his eyes grew cold as ice when rage took him. These physical transformations are consistent with the berserker state described in other sources. His most famous battle exploit occurred at Brunanburh in 937 CE, where he fought for King Athelstan of England against a coalition of Scots and Dublin Vikings. According to the saga, Egil fought his way through the enemy ranks to their standard, killing the standard bearer and several champions in single combat. When his own side began to retreat, he stood his ground, allowing others to escape while he faced multiple opponents alone. The saga describes how he became so furious that he threw away his shield and gripped his spear with both hands, rushing forward and killing or wounding everyone in his path. This berserker charge broke the enemy's will to pursue, saving many of his comrades. Afterward, Egil composed a poem about the battle that has survived to this day. Egil's physical capabilities seem to transcend normal human limitations. The saga describes him breaking stone with his bare hands, lifting massive boulders that several men couldn't move, and surviving wounds that would have killed ordinary warriors. Most famously, he survived having his skull crushed by a hammer blow, an injury that supposedly contributed to the deformation of his already unusual head. Archaeological findings lend some credence to these accounts. Examination of skeletal remains from the Viking Age shows evidence of healed injuries that would be considered life-threatening by modern standards, suggesting exceptional toughness among warriors of the period. The description of Egil's enlarged, misshapen head has led some medical historians to suggest he may have suffered from Paget's disease, a condition that causes bone enlargement and deformity. What made Egil particularly terrifying to enemies was his unpredictability. Unlike dedicated berserkers who served kings as elite guards, Egil was a free agent who followed his own code. He was as likely to turn on an ally as an enemy if he felt betrayed or insulted. King Eric Bloodaxe of Norway placed a bounty on his head after Egil killed several of the king's men, including his son, in various disputes. In perhaps his most audacious act, Egil deliberately placed himself in Eric's power in England, then composed a praise poem so magnificent that the king, despite his hatred, could not bring himself to execute such a gifted skald. This incident illustrates the complex value system of Viking culture, where poetic skill could sometimes outweigh even blood feud. Egil lived to an unusual age for a Viking warrior, dying in his 80s around 995 CE. In his final years, blind and frail, he allegedly had his treasure carried up to a mountainside, where he buried it, killing the slaves who helped him to keep its location secret. This final act of violence completes the picture of a man who lived by his own rules, embodying both the most refined and most brutal aspects of Viking culture. Would you want to face Egil in battle, knowing that behind his calculated strikes lurked a berserker rage that could erupt at any moment? Would you trust him as an ally, knowing his loyalty extended only as far as his personal code dictated? His complexity made him all the more terrifying, a thinking berserker whose fury was guided by cunning rather than blind rage. If Egil represents the individual berserker operating on the margins of society, Harald Sigurdsson, better known as Harald Hardrada, Hard Ruler, exemplifies the Viking warrior who channeled his terrifying abilities into imperial ambition. His life, chronicled in multiple contemporary sources, including the Byzantine accounts where he was known as Araltes, reads like an epic spanning 3 continents. Born around 1015 CE in Norway, Harald's path to becoming one of history's most feared warriors began early. At age 15, he fought alongside his half-brother King Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030. Though the battle ended in defeat and Olaf's death, young Harald distinguished himself with such ferocity that his reputation was established despite his youth. Wounded in the battle, Harald escaped to Kievan Rus, where he recovered and entered the service of Prince Yaroslav the Wise. Already demonstrating the tactical intelligence that would mark his career, He used this time to study Eastern military techniques and build political connections that would serve him later. By age 20, Harold had journeyed to Constantinople, where he joined the Varangian Guard, the elite Byzantine unit composed primarily of Norse warriors. Here, Harold's exceptional abilities found their perfect expression. The Varangians were the emperor's personal bodyguards and special operations force, deployed in the most critical and dangerous missions across the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine chronicles describe Harold as physically imposing, tall even by Norse standards, powerfully built, with piercing eyes and unusual self-control. Unlike berserkers who surrendered to battle fury, Harold's terror-inducing quality came from his cold, calculating approach to violence and his tactical brilliance. During his Byzantine service, approximately 1035 to 1045 CE, Harold fought in campaigns stretching from Sicily to the Holy Land, from the Balkans to Mesopotamia. Contemporary accounts credit him with developing innovative tactics that combined Norse aggression with Byzantine discipline. He pioneered night attacks, amphibious operations, and psychological warfare techniques that devastated enemies unused to such approaches. One particularly infamous incident occurred during a siege in Sicily, where Harold captured birds that nested in the city, attached small pieces of burning material to them, and released them to fly back to their nests, starting fires throughout the settlement. This combination of creative thinking and ruthlessness characterised his approach to warfare. The Byzantine princess Anna Komnene, though writing after Harold's time, preserved accounts of the Varangians' fighting style that match what we know of Harold. The Varangian, who has once raised his arm to strike, knows no middle path, nor does he need a second blow. Such is the strength behind his axe and his familiarity with killing. Harold's weapon of choice was indeed the long-handled axe, a weapon that required tremendous strength and skill, but could penetrate armour and shields that would turn aside swords. His personal fighting technique reportedly combined the ferocity of Norse berserkers with the disciplined footwork and tactical awareness of Byzantine professional soldiers. After amassing enormous wealth and military experience in Byzantine service, Harold returned north around 1045, using his fortune to fund a campaign for the Norwegian throne. He became king in 1046, earning his nickname Hardreder, Hard Ruler, through his ruthless consolidation of power and harsh taxation policies. As king, Harold continued to expand his military reputation. He waged war against Denmark for 17 years, developed Norway's first standing professional army, and created a naval force of unprecedented size and capability. Contemporary accounts suggest he personally designed improved longships with higher sides and stronger construction, better suited for the warfare of his era. Harold's final campaign, his invasion of England in 1066, demonstrates both his ambition and the terror his reputation inspired. When he landed with 300 ships and perhaps 9,000 warriors, many English lords immediately submitted rather than face him in battle. The initial English force sent against him at Fulford Gate was crushed so completely that the battle is often overlooked in histories focused on what came next. At Stamford Bridge, Harold finally met his match when King Harold Godwinson force-marched his army north to confront the Norwegian invasion. Even then, Harold's personal combat abilities nearly turned the tide. According to the sagas, he fought in the berserker state during this final battle, wielding his axe with such fury that the English line broke wherever he attacked. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, not given to praising Viking warriors, nevertheless records that the king of the Norwegians fought with reckless courage and struck down everyone within reach. It took an arrow to the throat to finally stop Harold Hardreder, ending the life of a man who had fought across 3 continents and nearly conquered a third kingdom at age 51. What made Harold particularly terrifying was not just his personal combat prowess, but his combination of Viking ferocity with sophisticated tactical thinking. Unlike many Viking leaders who relied on shock and aggression alone, Harold understood logistics, psychological warfare, and strategic patience. He could direct a campaign with Byzantine precision, then lead from the front with Norse fury when the decisive moment came. Would you want to face a warrior who had mastered combat techniques from across the known world, who commanded with the strategic vision of a general and fought with the personal ferocity of a berserker? Harold represented the Viking warrior tradition at its most evolved and dangerous, combining raw combat ability with intellectual brilliance in a way that few warriors in history have matched. Our third legendary warrior represents yet another variation on Viking military prowess, the independent commander whose loyalty could be won but never commanded. Thorkell the Tall, also called Thorkell the High, emerges from historical records around 1009 CE as the leader of the Jomsvikings, a semi-legendary band of elite warriors based at Jomsborg on the Baltic coast. The Jomsvikings themselves deserve mention as one of history's most unusual military organisations, a brotherhood of warriors bound by strict codes of conduct, who sold their services to the highest bidder but maintained their independence from any king. They accepted only the best fighters, required candidates to prove their worth through combat tests, and enforced rules that included never showing fear and never retreating from an equal or lesser force. Thorkell's physical appearance matched his name, described in chronicles as exceptionally tall and strong, towering over other warriors. While exact measurements are impossible to determine, archaeological evidence from the period shows that elite Viking warriors were indeed often taller than average, with some skeletal remains suggesting heights of 6 feet or more. Impressive for the medieval period. What made Thorkell exceptional was not just his physical prowess, but his ability to command absolute loyalty from some of the most dangerous fighters in the Norse world. The Jomsvikings followed him, not because of birth or political authority, but because he had proven himself the most formidable among them, a meritocracy of violence where leadership was earned through demonstrated ability. Thorkell's first major appearance in historical records comes during the Viking invasion of England, where he led a force that has been estimated at between 3,000 and 5,000 warriors, an enormous army for the period. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records that in 1009 to 1010, his force ravaged much of southern England, defeating every army sent against them. What distinguished Thorkell's operations from typical Viking raids was their systematic nature. Rather than simply plundering and leaving, his forces conducted what modern military analysts would recognise as a coordinated campaign, isolating targets, defeating relief forces, establishing secure supply lines, and using psychological warfare to maximise impact. During the Siege of Canterbury in 1011, Thorkell demonstrated both his military effectiveness and the limits of his control. His forces captured the city and took Archbishop Elfhere prisoner, demanding an enormous ransom. When the Archbishop refused to allow his ransom to be paid, knowing it would impoverish his people, some of Thorkell's drunken warriors killed him by pelting him with cattle bones during a feast. According to chronicles, Thorkell tried to protect the Archbishop, offering gold and all his possessions to spare the holy man's life. When his own warriors defied him and murdered Elfhere anyway, Thorkell broke with them, taking 40 ships and their crews into English service. This incident reveals a complexity to his character beyond simple violence, a sense of honour and perhaps even respect for courage that transcended cultural and religious boundaries. For the next several years, Thorkell served King Ethelred the Unready and then Cnut the Great, fighting against his former Viking allies. His military effectiveness is demonstrated by how eagerly these kings sought to retain his services. When Thorkell eventually fell out with Cnut and returned to Denmark, the king was concerned enough to negotiate his return rather than risk having him as an enemy. What made Thorkell particularly terrifying on the battlefield was his combination of personal combat skills with tactical acumen. The sagas describe him as nearly unbeatable in single combat, wielding a two-handed axe that could cleave through shield and mail with a single strike. Yet he was also a sophisticated commander who understood formation fighting, combined arms tactics, and the importance of discipline. One incident that captures Thorkel's extraordinary capabilities occurred during a battle against English forces in East Anglia. According to chronicles, when his front line began to waver, Thorkel personally led a countercharge, cutting down the English commander and several champions in rapid succession. His warriors, inspired by this display, rallied and turned a potential defeat into victory. Unlike berserkers who relied on battle frenzy, Thorkel's effectiveness came from technical skill and physical power combined with clear-headed tactical thinking. He represents a different model of Viking warrior, the professional commander who could match any man in personal combat, but whose true value lay in his ability to multiply force effectiveness through leadership. The final years of Thorkel's life are less well documented than his campaigns in England. He apparently reconciled with the Canute, received an earldom, and helped govern Denmark during Canute's absences. Some sources suggest he died around 1023 to 1025, while others imply he may have lived longer. The uncertainty itself speaks to his semi-legendary status, a man whose actual deeds were so extraordinary that they began to blend with myth even during his lifetime, broke wherever he attacked. Would you want to face Thorkel across a battlefield, knowing that he combined the personal combat skills of a champion with the strategic mind of a general? Would you trust your forces to stand firm against his Vikings, knowing their reputation for never retreating and never showing fear? His very name became a psychological weapon, with chronicles recording instances where English forces retreated upon merely hearing that Thorkel was approaching. These three warriors, Egil the berserker poet, Harold the imperial strategist, and Thorkel the independent commander, represent different expressions of Viking martial prowess. Each terrifying in his own way, they demonstrate that the most fearsome Viking warriors were not mindless brutes, but complex figures who combined physical capabilities, technical skill, and psychological insight to become living weapons. But what made such extraordinary warriors possible? To understand this, we must look deeper into the psychology and neuroscience of combat states that allowed Vikings to transcend normal human limitations on the battlefield. The extraordinary capabilities displayed by elite Viking warriors, whether berserkers, Ulfhednar, or legendary champions, raise profound questions about human potential. How could these fighters perform feats that seem to defy normal physical and psychological limitations? Modern science offers insights that help bridge the gap between myth and historical reality. At the neurobiological level, extreme combat states involve specific alterations in brain function. Under conditions of intense stress, the human brain undergoes dramatic changes in activity patterns. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational planning, impulse control and social behaviour, shows decreased activity, while deeper, more primitive brain structures become dominant. This shift in brain function has several effects directly relevant to the berserker phenomenon. First, the perception of pain is dramatically altered. Studies of soldiers in combat and extreme athletes have documented a condition called stress-induced analgesia, where the brain essentially shuts down pain signals. This explains how berserkers could continue fighting, despite wounds that would incapacitate ordinary people. Dr. Anna Wahlberg, a neuropsychologist who studies combat states, explains, "The body produces its own painkillers, endorphins and enkephalins, that are actually stronger than morphine. Under extreme stress, these flood the system, creating not just pain suppression, but sometimes a euphoric state that reinforces the behaviour. This neurochemical cascade includes other compounds as well. Adrenaline and noradrenaline increase heart rate, blood pressure, and muscle tension while directing blood flow to major muscle groups. Cortisol mobilises energy reserves. Dopamine creates a reward sensation that can make combat psychologically addictive. This cocktail of natural compounds can transform human capabilities, temporarily granting strength and endurance far beyond normal limits. The dissociative aspect of berserker states, the sense of becoming something other than human, also has neurological correlates. Under extreme stress, the brain's normal integration of sensory information, self-awareness and memory can fragment. This condition, called peritraumatic dissociation, creates altered states of consciousness where the individual may feel detached from their body or experience reality differently. Dr. Jonathan Shea, who studied combat trauma in Vietnam veterans, noted striking parallels between berserker descriptions and certain combat states he observed. The berserker state is real. I've seen it in combat veterans, a condition where they reported feeling invulnerable, experiencing no pain, having enormous strength, and later having no memory or only fragmentary memory of their actions. This memory disruption explains another aspect of berserker accounts, how warriors often couldn't remember what they had done during their battle fury. The stress hormones that facilitate extraordinary performance also interfere with memory formation, particularly explicit narrative memory. The hippocampus, crucial for forming coherent memories, functions poorly under extreme stress. The visual and physical transformations described in berserkers, facial swelling, colour changes, shivering, also have physiological explanations. Extreme sympathetic nervous system activation causes vasodilation and vasoconstriction patterns that can alter appearance. Muscle tremors result from the flood of adrenaline preparing the body for explosive action. Even the shield-biting behaviour has parallels in how some people involuntarily clench their jaws under stress. But neurophysiology alone doesn't explain the berserker phenomenon. Cultural and psychological factors played crucial roles in shaping how these natural human capacities were expressed and controlled. The Viking cultural context provided a framework that actively cultivated these altered states rather than suppressing them. Where many societies teach individuals to control and minimize stress responses, Viking warrior culture developed techniques to intentionally induce and direct them. This represents a fundamentally different approach to human potential, not denying our capacity for extreme states, but harnessing it. Dr. Magnus Nordborg, an anthropologist specializing in Norse warrior cultures, suggests the genius of the Viking approach was creating cultural technologies, rituals, training methods, belief systems that allowed warriors to access these extreme states reliably and with some degree of control. They were essentially hacking their own neurophysiology. The psychological preparation began in childhood. Young Norse boys were systematically desensitized to pain, cold, and fear through games and tests that modern observers would consider abusive. They were taught to conceptualize pain not as a signal to stop, but as an indication of effectiveness, a perspective shift that changes how the brain processes pain signals. The spiritual framework of Norse religion provided another crucial psychological element. By conceptualizing the berserker state as divine possession rather than a loss of control, warriors could surrender to it without fear. The belief that Odin himself entered them transformed what might otherwise be terrifying into something sacred and purposeful. Psychological conditioning techniques appear throughout saga descriptions of warrior training. Young fighters were subjected to unexpected attacks to develop instantaneous response patterns. They practiced fighting techniques until they became automatic, requiring no conscious thought. They engaged in ritualized duels with progressively more dangerous opponents, building confidence in their abilities under pressure. Modern sports psychology offers parallels to these ancient practices. The flow state, described by psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, characterized by complete absorption in an activity, altered time perception, and optimal performance, shares features with controlled combat states. Elite athletes train specifically to achieve this state, using techniques remarkably similar to those described in Viking training. The social dimension cannot be overlooked. Berserkers and Ulfhednar operated within warrior bands where extreme behaviour was not just accepted, but expected and rewarded. The social reinforcement created powerful incentives to achieve and maintain these states. Modern studies of combat units show that soldiers often fight more for their immediate comrades than for abstract causes, a principle the Vikings understood intuitively. The question of psychoactive substances remains controversial but plausible. the neurochemical effects of compounds found in plants known to the Vikings, including Amanita muscaria mushrooms, henbane, and certain fungi that grow and stored rye, ergot, could indeed potentiate natural stress responses or facilitate dissociative states. Ethnobotanist Wade Davis, who has studied warrior cults across cultures, notes, "The line between pharmacology and ritual is often blurred in traditional societies. Substances rarely work in isolation, but as part of cultural complexes that guide and interpret their effects. The Vikings likely used plant allies to help induce states that were simultaneously understood as both biological and spiritual." Some scholars have proposed that certain individuals may have had genetic or neurological differences that predispose them to these states. Conditions like Soto's syndrome, which causes unusual height and strength, certain forms of temporal lobe epilepsy, which can cause religious ecstasy and altered states, or genetic variations affecting hormone production could have made some individuals naturally more capable of achieving berserker states. This biological diversity might explain why some warriors became renowned for their abilities, while others, despite similar training, remained ordinary fighters. It may also explain accounts of berserker abilities running in families, like Egil Skallagrimsson's lineage of shapeshifters and berserkers. The psychological impact of berserkers and Ulfhednar on their opponents represents another dimension of their effectiveness. Combat performance depends not just on physical capabilities, but on the willingness to use them. When facing opponents who appear superhuman, impervious to pain, unnaturally strong and seemingly possessed, many fighters would experience paralyzing fear that degraded their own performance. Dr. David Grossman, a psychologist who studies combat behavior, has documented how the human brain has natural inhibitions against killing that must be overcome through training. Against ordinary opponents, these inhibitions might be manageable, but against berserkers who seemed more animal than human, the psychological barriers could become insurmountable. The terror inspired by berserkers created a feedback loop. Enemies fought poorly or fled, reinforcing the berserkers' confidence and reputation, which in turn inspired more fear in future opponents. This psychological dimension may have been as important to Viking military success as the physical capabilities of their elite warriors. Consider this question: how would you perform in combat if you believed your opponent was possessed by a god, felt no pain, and could not be stopped by normal means? The mere belief in berserker invulnerability could create actual invulnerability by paralysing opponents with fear. The Viking understanding of these psychological principles was sophisticated, if expressed in different terms than we would use today. They recognised that the mind and body formed an integrated system, that performance could be enhanced through both physical and psychological means, and that perception often matters more than reality in combat situations. What's most remarkable about the Viking approach to warrior psychology was its systematic nature. Rather than leaving combat performance to chance or individual temperament, they developed comprehensive methods to cultivate specific states of consciousness optimised for warfare. This represents one of history's most sophisticated approaches to human performance enhancement, achieved without modern technology or scientific understanding. But if these warriors were so effective, why did they eventually disappear? The answer involves changes not just in warfare, but in the cultural, religious and legal frameworks that had supported them. The decline of berserkers, Ulfhednar, and other elite Viking warriors was not a simple matter of military defeat, but a complex process involving religious transformation, legal prohibition, tactical evolution, and changing social structures. Their disappearance tells us as much about Viking society as their emergence did. The most significant factor was undoubtedly the Christianization of Scandinavia, a process that began in the late 10th century and was largely complete by the mid-12th century. Christianity brought fundamental changes to Norse cosmology and social organisation that proved incompatible with traditional warrior cults. The berserker and Ulfhednar traditions were inextricably linked to worship of Odin, a god the Church explicitly identified with demonic forces. Christian theology had no place for divine possession as a positive force. Altered states were categorized as either demonic possession or sinful loss of God-given reason. The spiritual framework that had given meaning to berserker practices was systematically dismantled. Archaeological evidence from this period shows deliberate destruction of sites associated with warrior cults. At Apokra in Sweden, ritual spaces where weapons and animal remains had been deposited were abandoned or repurposed for Christian worship. Amulets depicting berserkers and wolf warriors were replaced by Christian symbols. The material culture that had supported these traditions was literally buried or transformed. Legal prohibition followed religious change. The Gragas, Iceland's law code compiled in the 13th century, explicitly outlawed berserkergang. If a man goes berserk, he is liable to lesser outlawry, and the same applies to the men who are present unless they restrain him. Similar legal measures appeared throughout Scandinavia, transforming what had been an honoured warrior tradition into a criminal act. These laws reflect more than religious disapproval. They represent the consolidation of royal power and the state's monopoly on violence. As Scandinavian kingdoms became more centralised under Christian kings, independent warrior bands represented a threat to royal authority. By criminalising berserkers, kings eliminated potential rivals while demonstrating their commitment to Christian values. The sagas themselves document this transition. In earlier tales, berserkers are often portrayed as heroes, or at least respected warriors. In later sagas, they become stock villains, marauders and troublemakers who are righteously defeated by Christian heroes. This narrative shift reflects the changing cultural values of the society that produced these stories. Tactical and technological developments also contributed to the berserkers' decline. The increasing use of massed archery, cavalry, and disciplined infantry formations made individual warrior prowess less decisive in battle. Berserkers who charged ahead of the main force, once a terrifying shock tactic, became vulnerable to being isolated and overwhelmed by disciplined opponents. Archaeological evidence shows changes in Viking military equipment during this period. Earlier graves contain lighter weapons and minimal armour, suitable for mobile, aggressive fighters. Later burials show heavier armour, larger shields, and weapons designed for formation fighting. The material culture of warfare was evolving away from the berserker model. The Bayeux Tapestry, depicting the Norman, descended from Vikings, invasion of England in 1066, shows disciplined cavalry and infantry working in coordination, a far cry from the berserker charges described in earlier accounts. The Normans, though of Viking descent, had adopted Frankish military methods that emphasised discipline over individual fury. Psychological factors may have played a role as well. As Christianity spread, the belief systems that had made berserker states possible weakened. Warriors who no longer believed they could be filled with Odin's spirit might find it harder to access the psychological states that had enabled their predecessors' extraordinary performances. Dr. Nordborg suggests the berserker tradition required a specific cultural context to function. When that context changed, when the spiritual framework, social reinforcement, and tactical environment all shifted, the psychological technologies that created berserkers no longer worked as effectively. Medical historians have proposed another intriguing possibility, that knowledge of the substances potentially used to induce berserker states was deliberately suppressed by the Church. Plants like henbane and Amanita muscaria became associated with witchcraft rather than warfare. Their use, once perhaps part of warrior initiation, became a crime punishable by death. The Christianization process also changed how pain and suffering were understood. Where Viking culture had valued stoic endurance and even the embrace of pain as a path to transcendence, Christian theology emphasized pain as punishment, or test from God, to be endured passively rather than channeled into action. This fundamental shift in pain perception would have undermined a key psychological element of berserker practice. By the late 13th century, berserkers and Ulfhednar had largely disappeared from historical records, surviving primarily as literary figures in sagas rather than as active participants in warfare. The legendary champions who had combined berserker fury with tactical acumen had no successors. Warfare had become more regimented, less dependent on individual heroics. The fate of the last known berserkers is telling. In Vatnsdale saga, a berserker named Thorir is hired to clear troublemakers from a district in Iceland. After successfully completing his task, he is invited to a steam bath, where, relaxed and vulnerable, after his exertions he is assassinated. This narrative captures the changing times. The berserker, once feared and respected, has become a dangerous tool to be discarded when no longer needed. Archaeological evidence from the late Viking Age shows changes in burial practices that reflect this transition. Earlier warrior graves often contained animal remains, particularly bears and wolves, and shamanic items associated with altered states. Later burials show Christian influences. Crosses replace Thor's hammers. Weapons are less prominent, and animal remains disappear. The material culture of death itself was transformed. The disappearance of these warrior traditions represents more than a military change. It marks a fundamental shift in how Norse society understood human potential. The berserker tradition had embodied a belief that humans could transcend normal limitations through specific practices and altered states. Christianity brought a different model of transcendence, through grace rather than technique, in the afterlife rather than on the battlefield. Would berserkers and Ulfhednar have disappeared without Christianization? Possibly. Similar warrior cults in other cultures also declined as warfare became more organized and states consolidated power. The Japanese samurai, though continuing as a social class, abandoned earlier practices that resembled berserker techniques. The Roman gladiatorial tradition, which shared some features with berserker combat, was eventually suppressed by Christian emperors. What's clear is that the extraordinary warriors who had once been the terror of Europe did not simply lose battles, they lost the cultural context that made their existence possible. Their decline represents one of history's most dramatic examples of how changes in belief systems can transform not just social practices, but human capabilities themselves. As we look back across the centuries at these terrifying warriors, we're left with a profound question. Did humanity gain or lose something when the berserkers disappeared? The answer depends on whether we value the expanded human potential they represented more than the stability and restraint that came with their suppression. Though the berserkers, Ulfhednar, and their legendary champions vanished from battlefields nearly a millennium ago, their shadow stretches long across history and culture. Their legacy lives on in our collective imagination, in military psychology, and in our understanding of human potential, for both transcendence and terror. The most obvious continuation of their influence appears in literature and popular culture. The berserker archetype, the warrior who achieves superhuman capabilities through fury, appears across genres from fantasy to science fiction. From Tolkien's Bjorn to Marvel's Wolverine, from Star Wars Wookiees to countless video game characters who activate berserker mode. These ancient warriors have shaped how we imagine combat prowess beyond normal human limits, but their influence runs deeper than entertainment. Modern military psychology has rediscovered many principles that Viking warrior cults understood intuitively. Elite military units worldwide now train specifically to access controlled combat states that share features with berserker gang, heightened performance, pain suppression, and focused aggression. The US Navy SEAL's notorious Hell Week bears striking similarities to berserker initiation as described in the sagas. Sleep deprivation, exposure to extreme environments, and psychological stress designed to break down normal limitations and rebuild the warrior with expanded capabilities. The difference lies primarily in the framework of understanding. Where Vikings attributed these states to divine possession, modern military psychology uses the language of performance optimization. Sports psychology has developed parallel insights. The zone or flow state sought by elite athletes shares neurological features with combat-altered states. Modern athletes use visualization techniques, controlled breathing, and ritual preparations that would be recognizable to Viking warriors, though expressed in different cultural terms. Dr. Csikszentmihalyi, who pioneered research on flow states, noted, "What we call flow today has been recognized across cultures and throughout history. The Vikings simply developed particularly effective methods for it, has developed parallel insights. The zone or flow state sought by elite athletes shares neurological features with combat-altered states. Modern athletes use visualization techniques, controlled breathing, and ritual preparations that would be recognizable to Viking warriors, though expressed in different cultural terms." Dr. Csikszentmihalyi, who pioneered research on flow states, noted, "What we call flow today has been recognized across cultures and throughout history. The Vikings simply developed particularly effective methods for achieving it in combat contexts." Medical research has also validated aspects of berserker phenomena once dismissed as myth. Studies of extreme trauma cases document individuals performing seemingly impossible feats, lifting crushing weights, continuing complex actions despite grave injuries, or demonstrating strength far beyond their normal capacity. These cases confirm that human performance limitations are more flexible than once believed. The neurochemistry of stress responses that enabled berserker states is now being studied for both military applications and treatment of conditions like PTSD. The Viking intuitive understanding that these states could be both powerful and damaging, that berserkers were often described as weakened after their fury subsided, aligns with modern understanding of the physiological costs of extreme stress responses. Perhaps most significantly, the berserker tradition raises profound questions about human nature that remain relevant today. How much of our potential remains untapped under normal conditions? What are the costs and benefits of accessing extreme states? Where is the line between transcending limitations and losing essential humanity? These questions have ethical dimensions. The berserkers represented a weaponization of human potential, channeling expanded capabilities specifically toward violence. Their techniques worked, as evidenced by the terror they inspired across Europe. But at what cost to the warriors themselves and the societies they served? Modern neuroscientist Dr. Andrew Huberman, who studies states of optimal performance, observes, "The mechanisms that allowed berserkers to perform extraordinary feats are built into human neurophysiology. The question isn't whether these capabilities exist, but how we choose to develop and direct them." The archaeological record continues to yield insights about these warriors. Recent excavations at sites like Trelleborg in Denmark and Gnezdovo in Russia have uncovered training areas where Viking warriors practiced techniques that may have been related to berserker traditions. Residue analysis of drinking vessels has detected compounds consistent with psychoactive preparations mentioned in historical accounts. Genetic studies of populations in regions where berserkers were most prevalent have identified variations that might predispose individuals to the altered states described in the sagas. One such variation affects the metabolism of adrenaline, potentially allowing for more intense or prolonged stress responses, a genetic advantage in combat situations requiring extraordinary effort. The cultural memory of these warriors persists most strongly in Scandinavia itself. Annual reenactments of Viking combat in Norway, Sweden and Denmark often include berserkers, though with their more extreme behaviours moderated for modern sensibilities. These events serve as reminders of a heritage that is both celebrated for its strength and viewed with ambivalence for its violence. Perhaps the most thought-provoking aspect of the berserker legacy is how it challenges our assumptions about human progress. We often assume that we, with our scientific understanding and technological advantages, have expanded human capabilities beyond what our ancestors could achieve. The berserker phenomenon suggests the opposite possibility, that our ancestors may have developed certain human potentials more fully than we have, albeit in narrow domains. Dr. Wahlberg reflects, Modern humans rarely experience the full range of our physiological and psychological capabilities. Our comfortable environments and social constraints mean we seldom encounter situations that would trigger our most extreme responses. The berserkers deliberately created those conditions as a path to transcendence. This perspective invites us to reconsider our relationship with our evolutionary heritage. The stress responses that enabled berserker states evolved for survival in threatening environments. Modern life rarely activates these systems fully, leaving aspects of our potential unexplored. Some modern practices, extreme sports, certain meditation techniques, controlled exposure therapy, represent attempts to access these capabilities in constructive rather than destructive contexts. The ethical questions surrounding berserker-like states remain relevant in contemporary military contexts. As neuroscience develops better understanding of how to induce optimal performance states, military organisations face decisions about how far to push human capabilities and at what psychological cost. The Viking experience offers a historical case study of both the effectiveness and the consequences of such approaches. For those of us unlikely to experience combat, the berserker legacy still resonates. We all contain the potential for states beyond our normal experience, moments when crisis or inspiration pushes us beyond what we thought possible. The berserkers represent an extreme expression of a universal human capacity for transcending perceived limitations. As we look to the future, the berserker phenomenon raises questions about human enhancement. Modern technologies, from pharmaceuticals to genetic engineering, offer possibilities for expanding human capabilities that would have seemed magical to our ancestors. The Viking warrior traditions remind us that enhancement has always been part of human culture, though the methods have changed. Would you choose to experience a berserker state if you could do so safely? Would you want soldiers defending your country to access such capabilities? Would you prefer a world where such potentials remain largely dormant, or one where they are systematically developed? There are no simple answers, but the questions themselves connect us to those long-ago warriors who pushed the boundaries of human potential to their limits. In the end, perhaps the most important legacy of these terrifying warriors is the reminder that humanity contains multitudes, that within each of us lie capabilities far beyond our everyday experience for both creation and destruction. The berserkers channeled these capabilities toward violence, but the underlying potential belongs to our shared human heritage. The shadow they left behind is not just the memory of terror they inspired, but the question they force us to confront. What might we become if we were willing to transform ourselves as completely as they did? The berserkers and Ulfhednar may have vanished from battlefields centuries ago, but their legacy continues to fascinate and disturb us. These warriors who transform themselves into something beyond human, whether through training, ritual, substances, or sheer will, represent both the heights of human potential and the depths of our capacity for violence. As we've explored the historical reality behind these terrifying Viking warriors, we've uncovered a complex picture that moves beyond simple myths. Archaeological evidence, historical accounts, and modern science confirm that these weren't just legends, but real fighters who developed extraordinary capabilities through systematic methods. Their effectiveness was such that they inspired terror across Europe and became the elite forces of kings and warlords throughout the Viking world. What aspects of their story resonated most with you? Was it the berserkers' ecstatic fury, the Ulfhednar's predatory calculation, or the legendary champions who combined raw power with tactical genius? Each represents a different expression of the warrior ethos that defined the Viking Age. Perhaps you found yourself wondering, which would be more terrifying to face on a battlefield? A berserker's overwhelming rage, or an Ulfhedin's calculated hunt? Would you rather confront Egil Skallagrimsson's unpredictable combination of poetic genius and berserker fury, Harald Hardrada's cold, strategic brilliance, or Thorkel the Tall's towering presence and elite Jomsviking force? The questions these warriors raise about human potential remain relevant today? How much of our capability remains untapped in our comfortable modern lives? What price did these warriors pay for accessing states beyond normal human limitations? And what does their existence tell us about the thin veneer of civilization that separates us from our most primal instincts? If you found this exploration of Viking warrior psychology fascinating, you might enjoy our upcoming examination of other elite warrior traditions throughout history. From the Aztec eagle warriors who captured enemies for ritual sacrifice to the Japanese shinobi, who developed almost supernatural abilities of stealth and deception, human cultures have repeatedly produced fighters who transcended normal limitations through specialized training and altered states of consciousness. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which of these Viking warriors would you least want to face in battle? Do you see parallels between berserker techniques and modern military or athletic training? And what other historical warrior traditions would you like to see explored in future videos? Remember to subscribe and hit the notification bell to ensure you don't miss our continuing exploration of history's most extraordinary warriors and the psychological states that made them possible. The berserkers may be gone, but the human potential they represented remains within us all, for better or worse. Until next time, remember that the most terrifying aspects of history aren't the monsters we imagine, but the very real human beings who made themselves into something beyond human. The berserkers weren't myths. They were men who transformed themselves into living weapons through methods that pushed the very boundaries of what it means to be human.